In a room filled with power, beneath the marble columns, under the watchful eyes of a divided Congress, one man rose, J.D. Vance, armed not with a team of lobbyists, not with corporate dollars, but with the truth. In just 5 minutes, he destroyed a hidden scheme designed to strip hope from 300,000 working families. What he said that day made America stop, made America question itself. Are we still protecting the people who built this country? Or have we forgotten them in the shadows of ambition? What you are about to see is a story told to capture the heart of that moment, drawn from the spirit of real struggles, real voices, and real hopes. The details, the names, the setting may be imagined, but the emotions, the fight, and the questions are deeply true. This is more than fiction. It is a reflection of the choices we face and the courage it takes to make them. So as you watch, as you remember, ask yourself, if you stood in that chamber, in that moment, what would you choose? What happens next isn't just a story, it's a reminder of what we stand for. The chamber felt colder that morning, though the grand hearing room of the Budget Committee always carried a certain chill. Sunlight filtered through high-arched windows, casting fractured beams across worn oak desks. Desks scarred by decades of quiet deals and loud betrayals. The American flag hung motionless behind the dais, its colors dulled by time, its fabric heavy with the weight of history. J.D. Vance stepped inside, boots echoing on the polished floor, his face calm but his mind already alert. He had walked into hundreds of hearings, but something about today felt staged. The air hummed, not with debate or honest conversation, but with something rehearsed. Staffers whispered at the edges of the room. Cameras clicked, more than usual. The hum of conversation was different, more like a well-practiced chorus waiting for a conductor's cue. J.D. took his seat, eyes sweeping the room. Committee members shuffled papers that looked untouched. Their glances at one another were too quick, too knowing. He spotted Jasmine Crockett across the chamber, composed, confident, lips pressed in a faint smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. The chair gavelled in the session. And just like that, the so-called routine meeting began. Jasmine rose, her voice clear, measured and polished as if she'd spent the night rehearsing in front of a mirror. She spoke of a new budget package, her words laced with phrases like global leadership, modern alliances, and a future-ready economy. The tone was one of optimism, vision, the kind that drew polite nods and safe applause. But J.D. noticed. Her hands clenched the podium just a little too tightly, and her eyes darted for a second toward a group of aides in the corner. The applause came on cue, scattered at first, then swelling unnaturally, like a wave that didn't belong to the tide. J.D. didn't clap. Instead, he leaned back slightly, eyes narrowed, watching, listening. Global leadership, modern alliances, he thought. Since when did budget hearings become foreign policy speeches? His gut tightened. There was no mention of domestic steel, of the manufacturing heartlands, of the workers who kept the gears of America turning. And yet, line after line, Crockett's proposal wrapped itself in the language of progress, of inevitability. A staffer passed J.D. a thick folder, the budget draft. The pages smelled faintly of fresh ink, rushed from the printer. He flipped through, his thumb pausing on a line that made his pulse quicken. A quiet redirection of funds, small in print but massive in meaning. Money once promised to revitalize steel towns, repurposed under vague labels like infrastructure partnerships and international development opportunities. J.D.'s heart pounded, not with fear, but with recognition. This wasn't a routine meeting. This was a play, and he just caught sight of the script. And yet, the room carried on as if blind. Members exchanged glances that said, "Let's move this along." The chair's smile seemed a little too eager, his gavel taps a little too sharp. J.D. forced himself to breathe, steady and slow. His mind raced. Why the rush? Why now? His gaze returned to Jasmine, who was thanking the committee, her voice sweet as honey but hollow at its core. Behind her, one aide jotted something, glanced at a phone, then subtly nodded toward a cluster of lobbyists seated in the back row. J.D.'s eyes fixed on that nod, small but telling. Who exactly benefits from this package? Outside, a siren wailed in the distance, a reminder of the world beyond these walls, the world that would feel the consequences of whatever happened in this chamber today. JD adjusted his notes, pen tapping once on the desk, a silent promise to himself. Not today, not without answers. The chair cleared his throat, voice too smooth. Shall we proceed to a vote schedule? But JD wasn't ready to proceed. He wasn't ready to let this pass unnoticed. And as he glanced once more at the budget draft, the pieces began to fit, and the first seeds of resistance took root. JD didn't wait for the gavel's echo to fade. As the committee room emptied, members eager to return to offices, reporters chasing sound bites, JD slipped through a side corridor, his mind heavy with the weight of what he'd seen. The budget lines danced in his head, the hollow applause still ringing faintly in his ears. The polished marble walls reflected his image back at him, a man who'd come expecting routine, and found instead a storm brewing behind polite smiles. In a small, dim office down the hall, JD's aide, Tom, waited, shoulders tense, fingers drumming an uneven rhythm on a stack of papers. The door clicked shut behind JD, sealing them off from the bustle outside. The hum of the Capitol seemed distant here, as if they'd stepped outside time itself. Tom didn't waste words. His voice was low but urgent. Sir, I pulled the details you asked for. It's worse than we thought. He slid the papers across the desk, hands trembling just enough for JD to notice. JD scanned the documents, each line confirming his worst fears. Funding for Steeltown recovery, millions earmarked to restart furnaces, rebuild communities, retrain proud workers, quietly rerouted. Buried beneath layers of bureaucratic language were terms that told the real story. International development initiatives, foreign infrastructure collaborations, cross-border economic partnerships. It wasn't just a budget proposal, it was a quiet surrender. JD leaned back, exhaling slowly, his eyes tracing the figures as if willing them to change. But they didn't. The ink was fresh, but the betrayal was old as the mills themselves. His mind painted the consequences with cruel clarity. Smokestacks that once marked prosperity standing cold against gray skies, their brick bases cracked and forgotten. Streets that once pulsed with shift changes empty now. Shops boarded up, their windows like blind eyes turned from the future. Outside the office window, the Capitol dome gleamed in the fading afternoon sun, a beacon meant to symbolize strength, but now casting long shadows over the choices made within its walls. JD's gaze hardened. They dressed it up in the language of progress, but they're gutting the heart of this country, he said, more to himself than to Tom. Tom nodded, swallowing hard. If we don't stop this, his voice trailed off, the unspoken truth filling the space between them. The image gripped JD, a steel town at dusk. He'd walked those streets before, felt the spirit of the people who built the nation's backbone with bare hands and iron will. He could see it now. The factory gates rusted shut, the last shift long since clocked out. Kids playing in empty lots where their parents once worked, their laughter thin against the quiet. The hum of machinery replaced by the hollow whistle of the wind. And it wasn't just one town, it was a dozen, 100. The places that forged tanks and rails and skyscrapers, forgotten in the name of modern alliances. JD looked back at Tom, voice steady, resolve beginning to form like steel cooling in a mold. We're not letting this pass, not like this. And as he gathered the papers, his mind already turning to the fight ahead, the echoes of that hollow applause from the hearing chamber seemed to follow him. No longer a memory, but a warning of what came next. The corridor outside waited, and so did the storm. The storm outside had passed, but inside JD's office, the air still felt heavy, as if the echoes of the day's revelations clung to the walls. The city lights of Washington glimmered beyond the window, their glow muted by the hour, casting long, broken reflections across his desk strewn with budget papers, reports, and scribbled notes. But JD wasn't looking at them anymore. His eyes had drifted to the one thing in the room that never failed to ground him. A small letter pinned just above his desk, yellowed at the edges, the handwriting uneven, careful like a child trying hard to make it perfect. Please don't let them take Daddy's job. He stared at the words, tracing each letter in his mind as if seeing them for the first time, though he'd read them 100 times before. The letter had arrived months earlier, folded in a plain envelope without a return address, tucked between stacks of formal correspondence. It had stopped him cold then, and it did now. Behind those words was a town he knew too well, a town with a name that rarely made headlines, a place where smokestacks touched the sky, where work boots left trails of steel dust on cracked sidewalks, a town that had given its strength to build America and had been paid back with broken promises. J.D. sank into his chair, the soft creak loud in the stillness. He rubbed his temples, fatigue pressing down like a weight he could no longer ignore. His mind replayed the day's moments. The hollow applause, the hidden budget cuts, the cold nods between lobbyists and lawmakers. And now the letter's simple plea echoed over it all. Was he enough? The question gnawed at him, as it had on nights like this. Could one voice, one stand, stop a machine built on ambition, profit, and polished words? Could he hold the line against forces that had outlasted better men before him? He pictured that steel town again, not in statistics or reports, but in faces. The father who'd handed him the letter at a rally, too proud to speak the words out loud. The mother he'd seen working 2 jobs to keep the lights on. The boy who'd offered a small, grease-smudged flag during a 4th of July parade, eyes wide with hope. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, indifferent to the weight of what the next day would bring. J.D. let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. His gaze returned to the letter, its edges curled, ink slightly faded, but message as clear as the day it arrived. He rose slowly, walked to the window, and looked out at the Capitol dome, now a silhouette against the deep blue of night. Somewhere beyond that dome, decisions were being made. Decisions that would either honor or break that promise written in a child's hand. His reflection stared back at him in the glass, weary but not beaten. He knew the odds. He knew the cost. But the promise wasn't just to that child or to that father. It was to every worker who had been told to wait, to trust, to hope, and who had been left waiting too long. J.D.'s voice broke the silence, soft but steady, a vow to no one but himself. I have to try. And as the night deepened, so did his resolve, the kind of quiet steel that no applause could give and no defeat could take away. Morning broke with the first light crawling across the Capitol stone walls, but inside its chambers, the pace of the day felt anything but slow. J.D. entered the committee room, his steps purposeful, his mind sharpened by the weight of the night before. He had spent hours preparing amendments, carefully drafted to slow the march of the budget package, to force debate, to demand answers. Yet as he approached his seat, the uneasy energy that had haunted him the day prior seemed only to have deepened. Crockett's coalition was already at work. The room hummed with a different kind of urgency, not the passion of debate or the clash of ideas, but the mechanical efficiency of a train set in motion, one no longer concerned with those standing in its path. Staffers moved briskly, arms full of documents. J.D. recognized his amendments among them, carefully prepared, highlighted, annotated with notes of genuine concern for the communities he had vowed to protect. But one by one, those papers disappeared into shredders humming quietly at the corners of the room. J.D.'s eyes followed the motions, disbelief giving way to anger as the reality became clear. They weren't even going to read his proposals, let alone consider them. He opened his mouth to protest, but the chair had already recognized another speaker, one of Crockett's closest allies, delivering yet another glowing statement about global responsibility and visionary economics. J.D.'s hands clenched the edge of his desk, knuckles white. He waited for his chance, and when the room finally quieted, when the scripted praise had run its course, he stood. His voice, steady but firm, cut through the polished rehearsals. Mr. Chairman, I move that we delay this vote. There are provisions here that demand proper review. We owe that much to the people we represent. A murmur spread through the room, not of agreement, but of irritation, as if J.D.'s plea was little more than a stone tossed onto smooth waters. The chair offered a thin smile, the kind worn by men who had long ago chosen comfort over conscience. Senator Vance, we appreciate your passion, but this committee has a duty to move forward. The world doesn't wait for us to cling to the past. The word past hung in the air like an accusation. JD felt it like a slap. Crockett's eyes met his, calm, unwavering. Not with the fire of a true opponent, but with the cold certainty of someone convinced that history had already chosen her side. Another staffer approached the dais, whispering to the chair. JD caught fragments. Press lined up, statements prepared, timing is good. It was a machine, well-oiled, well-timed, indifferent to the protests of one man standing against its momentum. But JD wasn't ready to be swept aside. This isn't about the past, he said, louder now, the steel in his voice rising. It's about the future we're choosing, and whether that future includes the people who built this country. But the room had moved on. The chair tapped the gavel with quiet finality, signaling the next phase, the next speech, the next step down a path that seemed designed to leave voices like JD's behind. As JD sat, the weight of the moment settled on him. He had tried to slow the train, but the train wasn't slowing. If anything, it was gaining speed. And as the committee pressed forward, JD's mind turned not to the chamber's polished speeches, but to the factories and families whose hopes now hung in the balance. Hopes he refused to abandon, no matter how fast that train barreled on. The meeting ended, but the battle didn't stay confined within the walls of Congress. By nightfall, JD found himself facing an opponent even harder to engage. The court of public opinion, shaped and sharpened by the media's endless commentary. He sat alone in his office, the Capitol's glow dim through the window, as the television screen across from his desk flickered with faces far more polished, far more practiced in the art of influence. A well-known anchor leaned forward, smirking just slightly, the kind of expression designed to charm and cut at once. Senator Vance, the anchor said, seems determined to cling to an economy that doesn't exist anymore. I mean, steal jobs? That's like fighting to bring back coal from the 80s. The studio audience chuckled on cue. The other panelists nodded in agreement, the conversation moving on before JD's name had even left the screen. JD muted the television, but the words echoed anyway. Cling to an economy that doesn't exist anymore. The phrase repeated in his mind, as if daring him to argue. He rose, crossed to the window, and looked out over the city, its monuments shining, its streets quiet, its decisions shaping lives far beyond the glow of those lights. He thought of the steel towns again. They weren't relics, they were real. Communities where men and women still rose before dawn, hoping that today the call would come for work. Where churches and schools and corner stores still stood, held together by pride and memory as much as by brick and mortar. JD turned back to his desk, heart pounding with equal parts frustration and resolve. If the networks wouldn't tell the truth, he would. He grabbed a pen, the old-fashioned kind, heavy in the hand, the kind his grandfather would have used, and began to write. Line by line, he poured out what the cameras had ignored, that the fight for steel jobs wasn't about nostalgia, but about dignity, about fairness, about refusing to abandon entire communities in pursuit of profit, cloaked as progress. He wrote of fathers who had built ships and bridges, of mothers who'd kept homes and hopes alive through the hardest times. He wrote of children who deserved more than empty promises and shuttered factories. By dawn, the op-ed was finished. Raw, honest, urgent. JD sent it to the major outlets, certain that somewhere, someone would see what was at stake. He waited, pacing the office as the first light crept through the window. The rejections came swiftly. Not timely for our readership. Doesn't align with our current editorial focus. Appreciate your passion, Senator, but this isn't where the national conversation is right now. JD read the replies in silence, the glow of his desk lamp casting long shadows across the scattered pages. Outside, the city stirred, oblivious to the small defeat playing out behind this single window. He closed his eyes, drawing a breath, steadying himself. The smokescreen had been laid thick, but he knew the truth didn't disappear just because others refused to see it. And as he gathered the pages of his rejected words, folding them with care, his mind turned to the next move. The train might be speeding ahead, the media might cheer it on, but JD Vance wasn't done fighting. Somehow, some way, the country would hear what it needed to hear, and he would make sure of it. The rejections from the media still echoed in JD's thoughts as he walked the long hallway back toward the committee chamber. His steps slowed, the sound of his shoes on the marble floor somehow louder in the early evening hush. The building had begun to empty, the bustle of the day giving way to the quiet hum of cleaners and security staff. But JD wasn't ready to leave. Not yet. He spotted Senator Mark Ellison near the chamber doors, a man JD had once considered an ally, perhaps even a friend. They'd stood together on factory floors during campaigns, had shared coffee in small-town diners, had shaken the same calloused hands of workers who now waited for promises to be kept. JD quickened his pace, hope flickering that maybe here, at least, was someone who might still listen. "Mark," JD called, his voice low but firm. The older man turned, offering a tight smile that didn't quite touch his eyes. They stepped into a small alcove, away from the passing staffers. JD didn't waste time. "You can't back this plan. You know what it means for our towns, for the people who believed in us." Ellison's gaze dropped for a moment before meeting JD's again. His voice was soft, almost apologetic. "It's not that simple anymore, JD. There's pressure from all sides. Foreign partnerships, future trade deals. The world's changing." JD shook his head, disbelief and frustration rising. "So we just leave them behind? The men and women who built this country? We call that progress?" Ellison sighed, the weariness of too many compromises settling on his shoulders. "Times change, JD. You either change with them or you get left behind." The words hit harder than any public rebuke, not because they were loud or cruel, but because they were spoken with finality, the kind that closed a door JD had hoped might still be open. Ellison clapped a hand on JD's arm. The gesture meant to soften the blow, but JD barely felt it. His so-called friend turned and walked away, his footsteps fading into the growing quiet. JD stood there for a long moment, watching the empty corridor where Ellison had gone. The building felt larger somehow, the weight of it pressing down, its marble columns and high ceilings cold and distant. He drew a breath and turned back toward the committee chamber, its door still open, the room beyond dim and empty now. He stepped inside, his eyes adjusting to the soft glow of a few remaining lights. The desks sat in silent rows, papers scattered where hurried hands had left them, microphones tilted askew. The gavel lay abandoned on the dais, a symbol of authority that, for today at least, had chosen speed over scrutiny, convenience over conscience. JD walked slowly down the aisle, his hand brushing the edge of a desk as if searching for an anchor. He thought of the steel towns again, the quiet streets, the shuttered mills, the families waiting for someone to fight for them. He had come here to be that someone, but tonight, the chamber felt like a place where battles were lost before they were even begun. The last light flickered once, then steadied. JD stood alone, the room vast around him, the silence deep. He knew he would not sleep much that night. The speeding train hadn't just gathered steam, it had left the station. And if he was going to stop it, he'd have to find a way to stand on the tracks himself. And so he remained for a moment longer, the hum of the empty chamber filling his ears, before turning toward the door, the weight of what came next heavy on his shoulders. The hum of the Capitol faded behind him as JD stared out the window of the train, watching the city give way to the quiet sprawl of the heartland. The journey wasn't planned, but it felt necessary, as if the answers he couldn't find in marble halls and polished chambers might still live in the places that had first taught him what America was supposed to stand for. He sat in silence, the rhythm of the rails beneath him steady and unchanging, a welcome contrast to the chaos he'd left behind. By afternoon, JD stepped off the platform into a town that time hadn't so much forgotten as paused, as if waiting for someone to remember it again. The air was sharp with the faint scent of rust and old coal, carried on a wind that swept through streets lined with hollowed-out storefronts and sagging awnings. He walked slowly, boots crunching on grit and broken glass, eyes tracing the shapes of buildings that had once bustled with life. Windows stared back at him, shattered or boarded over. The main drag was dotted with the skeletons of diners and shops, their hand-painted signs faded beyond reading. Grass and weeds spilled over cracked sidewalks. In the distance, the steel mill's smokestacks rose against the gray sky, cold and silent, like monuments to promises made and broken. JD's footsteps led him to a small school, or what had been one. The lot beside it had once held company picnics, 4th of July fairs, the laughter of children weaving between tables of food. Now the chain-link fence sagged, and the swings in the playground creaked in the breeze. Inside the building's shadowed entry, a man swept the floor, the sound of the broom's bristles soft against the scuffed linoleum. JD paused at the door, watching the figure move with slow precision, as if caring for the place even when few cared anymore. The man looked up, squinting in the dim light, recognition dawning in his lined face. "Senator Vance? Thought that was you." JD stepped forward, offering his hand. "Sam, I wasn't sure you'd still be here." Sam chuckled, setting the broom aside. "Where else would I go? This town's in my blood. The mill, too." They sat on the front steps, the steel mill visible through the gap in the trees, its bulk both familiar and haunting. JD listened as Sam spoke, of shifts that once paid enough to raise a family, of co-workers who'd become brothers, of pride that no layoff or shutdown could steal. "I'm a janitor now," Sam said, not bitter, just stating a fact. "Keeps me moving, and I still get to look after this place." His gaze swept the playground, the lot, the mill beyond. "But I'd go back in a heartbeat, JD. I'd do it all again if I could. That work, it built this country, and I'd be damn proud to do it again." JD felt the fire kindle again inside him, the same fire that had carried him to the Senate, that had withstood rejection, betrayal, and mockery. This town, these people, they weren't relics. They were the soul of the nation, waiting for someone to fight for them. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the town's empty streets, JD rose, shaking Sam's hand once more. "Thank you, Sam. I needed this." He walked back toward the station, the weight of the capital still on his shoulders, but now matched by a purpose reforged, stronger, clearer, ready for the fight that lay ahead. The train's whistle sounded in the distance, a call to return, and JD answered without hesitation. The train rocked gently as it carried JD back toward the capital, but his mind didn't follow. It stayed behind in the quiet streets and empty lots of the steel town, in the shadows of the mill where ghosts of the past still seemed to walk. The rhythm of the wheels on the tracks became the pulse of old memories, fragments that rose unbidden, vivid and sharp, as if no time had passed at all. He saw his grandfather again, standing tall despite the years, his back straight, his hands rough and blackened from decades of work at the mill. JD could almost hear the clink of the old man's lunch pail, the familiar creak of worn boots on the front porch as dawn broke. The factory whistle would sound, long and low, and the town would come to life. JD closed his eyes and the scenes played on. A boy's view of Main Street draped in flags for the 4th of July, his hands small in his grandfather's as they watched the parade pass by. Veterans, steelworkers, marching bands. The heart of a town that knew who it was and what it stood for. The smell of roasted peanuts, the music of laughter, the sense that, for all its struggles, this place mattered. But when JD opened his eyes, the view beyond the train window offered no comfort. Fields lay fallow where factories once stood. Rows of houses sagged under the weight of abandonment, their windows dark, their porches empty. Here and there, a foreclosure sign tilted in the wind, forgotten by the bank that had left it behind. Streets that had once echoed with the sounds of morning shift changes and children at play now lay silent, broken only by the cry of a distant train whistle, lonelier now than it had ever sounded in his youth. The boy he had been had once believed that the strength of those mills, of the men and women who worked them, was unshakable. But the man he was now knew better. He had seen how quickly promises could be broken, how easily pride could be eroded by neglect disguised as progress. And yet sitting there, JD felt something deeper take root, a truth that steadied him even as it saddened him. This wasn't about politics. Not really. It wasn't about party lines or sound bites or the hollow victories of legislative games. It was about the fight for dignity, for fairness, for the simple right of a town, of a people, to believe that they still had a place in the future of the country they helped build. He thought again of Sam's words, "I'd do it all again," and of the little girl's letter pinned in his office. The ink faded, but the meaning still bright. As the train neared the city, its lights glowing on the horizon, JD straightened in his seat. The Capitol awaited. The polished floors, the scripted speeches, the endless maneuvering. But this time, he wouldn't walk back in as just another senator caught in the machine. He would walk back as a man with a purpose forged not in committees or back rooms, but in the mills and streets of the towns that had been forgotten. And as the train slowed, its brakes hissing softly, JD felt the weight of those memories shift from burden to fuel. The fight ahead would be hard, but it was one he could no longer walk away from. Not now, not ever. The train slid into the station under cover of night, but JD felt no weariness as he stepped onto the platform. The city's lights flickered beyond the tracks, and the Capitol dome loomed in the distance, pale against the dark sky. The quiet determination that had settled over him during the ride back did not fade as his boots met the pavement. If anything, it burned brighter, sharper, as if the memories of the steel town, of Sam's quiet pride and the hollowed streets had forged something unbreakable inside him. He walked the final blocks to his office in near silence, the hum of the city a distant chorus that seemed to belong to another world. By the time he entered the building, most of the staff had gone home, leaving only the low glow of emergency lights and the faint scent of coffee that had long gone cold. JD welcomed the stillness. It was in the quiet hours that real work got done. Not the kind that made headlines, but the kind that mattered. He dropped his coat on the chair and sat at his desk, pulling the thick budget draft toward him. The pages felt heavier now, as if they carried the weight of the towns he'd left behind. He flipped through line after line, his pen scratching notes in the margins, circling figures, drawing connections that others had either missed or chosen to ignore. The deeper he dug, the clearer the pattern became. Funds funneled, promises broken, communities traded for vague international partnerships, dressed up in language meant to soothe but not to save. The hours slipped by unnoticed. A single desk lamp cast long shadows across the floor as JD spread the documents out, building a map of betrayal in ink and numbers. His handwriting grew cramped at the edges, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. Each discovery hardened his resolve. Each hidden clause another reason to stand. The Capitol might have turned its gaze elsewhere, but JD refused to. In the early hours before dawn, he finally leaned back, rubbing his eyes, his mind humming with the connections he'd uncovered. He stared at the map he'd created, a tangle of notes, arrows, and figures that told the story the polished speeches had tried to hide. He could see it now as clearly as the mill's smokestacks rising against the gray sky, and he knew what had to come next. JD stood, walked to the window, and watched the first faint blush of morning touch the city. The Capitol dome gleamed softly, its silhouette a reminder of the duty that came with standing beneath it. With a deep breath, JD turned back to his desk, picked up the phone, and placed the call. His voice was steady, clear. "I'm requesting 5 minutes on the floor before the vote. That's all I ask." There was hesitation on the other end, the kind that came from people who preferred not to rock the boat. But JD's tone left no room for refusal. The request was noted, the time granted. And as he set the receiver down, JD felt no triumph, only the weight of the promise he had made and the knowledge that 5 minutes would have to be enough to speak for those who had no voice in that chamber. The city began to stir outside, but inside, JD's focus narrowed to the fight that would soon unfold. 5 minutes, one chance, and he was ready. The city was fully awake by the time JD stepped into his office, though he felt as if he'd never truly left the night's work behind. The air outside was crisp, but inside the Capitol, the temperature seemed to rise with the undercurrent of activity. The low hum of conversations, the shuffle of papers, the hurried steps of staffers who knew something big was about to happen. JD had seen storms build before, but this one was different. It was controlled, precise, manufactured down to the last detail. The moment he powered up his computer, the deluge began. His inbox, quiet through the long night, now filled by the second, messages from constituents, or at least what appeared to be. Form letters, praise for the international plan, all bearing the same polished language: visionary, forward-thinking, positioning America for global leadership. Dozens, then hundreds, each one a variation on the same theme. JD scrolled through them, his jaw tightening as the pattern became impossible to ignore. He recognized the fingerprints of the PR machine, phrases crafted not in town halls or living rooms, but in boardrooms and marketing offices. This wasn't the voice of the people. It was the voice of those who had the resources to flood the airwaves, the inboxes, the public square itself, until truth was drowned out by the sheer volume of spin. Outside his office, the mood in the halls confirmed it. JD paused at the threshold, watching lobbyists gathered in small knots, their suits sharp, their smiles sharper. They spoke in low tones, but the satisfaction was plain. A handshake here, a quiet laugh there. The kind of quiet celebration that comes before the win is declared official. JD's aides approached, their faces pale with the strain of the morning. One of them, a young man who had once campaigned alongside JD in mill towns and union halls, hesitated before speaking. "Senator, maybe it's time to reconsider. This vote, it's going through. The momentum's too strong." JD said nothing at first, letting the weight of the moment hang between them. He turned back to the window, watching as the Capitol grounds filled with staffers, reporters, and visitors, all moving with purpose towards something they believed inevitable. The storm had been orchestrated to perfection, but JD wasn't ready to let it wash over him. He shook his head slowly, his voice low but certain. "No, that's exactly what they want. For us to believe it's too late, but it's not. Not yet." Another aide tried again, more gently this time. "Sir, a 5-minute speech won't change the outcome. It could hurt you politically, make it look like you're out of step." JD turned, meeting their gaze one by one. "Then let it. I'm not here to protect myself. I'm here to speak for the people they're leaving behind." The aides fell silent, the weight of his words settling over them. They stepped back, understanding that the decision was made. JD picked up the file he had prepared. Notes scrawled in the margins, key points underlined, arrows connecting figures to the faces they represented. The halls buzzed louder as he stepped out, the storm of influence and ambition raging around him. But inside, JD felt steady, clear. The machine could celebrate its victory early if it wished. He hadn't spoken yet, and 5 minutes could still mean everything. As he walked toward the chamber, the lobbyist's laughter seemed to fade behind him, replaced by the sound of his own heartbeat, steady as the steel he was determined to defend. The storm of voices, hurried footsteps, and low murmur of deals in progress filled the corridors as JD made his way toward the chamber. Every corner seemed occupied by lobbyists in hushed conversation or aides ferrying last-minute documents. Yet through the noise, a voice called softly, the kind of voice that carried weight without needing to rise above the din. "Vance, a word?" JD turned to see Senator Robert Kearns standing near the edge of the hall. Kearns, the elder statesman with nearly 4 decades of service, whose retirement was only weeks away. His silver hair caught the light, and there was something in his eyes that JD hadn't seen in many of his colleagues lately. Honesty, maybe even regret. Without waiting for an answer, Kearns motioned JD into a quiet alcove, away from prying ears. He reached into his coat and drew out a slim, sealed envelope, its contents heavy despite its size. He pressed it into JD's hand. "You're one of the few left who still gives a damn," Kearns said quietly. "These are internal reports, job impact studies, budget analyses, the kind that weren't supposed to see daylight. They buried them to make this all look cleaner than it is." JD weighed the envelope in his palm, feeling the significance of the gesture more than the paper itself. His voice was low. "Why give this to me?" The older man smiled, but it was a tired smile, worn from too many battles fought and lost. "Because I've seen what happens when no one speaks up. I won't be here when the dust settles, but you will. Do something good with this, son." For a moment they stood in the hush of that small space, the chaos of the Capitol fading beyond the walls. JD saw in that moment not just a retiring senator, but a man who had lived through cycles of hope and compromise, and who, at the end, chose to pass the torch one final time. Kearns rested a hand briefly on JD's shoulder, a gesture that said more than words could, then turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd as quietly as he had appeared. JD didn't move at first, his fingers tightening around the envelope. Then, with resolve hardening within him, he stepped back into his office, shutting the door behind him. He broke the seal with care, unfolding the documents, each page confirming what he had suspected and feared. Charts and data points, projections and summaries, all showing the same truth. Thousands of jobs at risk, entire regions destabilized, communities sacrificed for deals cloaked in the language of progress. His pen was in his hand before he realized it, drawing lines between figures, connecting the hidden threads. He could see the shape of the trap now, the path carefully designed to rush past scrutiny, to silence dissent with a flood of false praise and a wave of political momentum. JD sat back exhaling, his heart heavy but his mind clear. He had the final piece of the puzzle. The machine was powerful, but it wasn't perfect. It had left cracks, and now he had what he needed to show the country where those cracks lay. As the chamber bell rang, signaling the final call before the vote, JD rose, tucking the documents under his arm. The 5 minutes he had fought for would have to be enough, and with this new truth in hand, he was determined to make every second count. The bell's low, resonant clang echoed through the Capitol corridors, a final summons that signaled what so many had worked toward, and what so few had dared to question. The vote was near. The storm JD had felt building from the first moment of that so-called routine meeting was about to break. But now, with the sealed documents from Kearns tucked inside his folder and the weight of forgotten voices pressing on his heart, JD walked with purpose, not toward surrender, but toward his last, best chance to speak. The chamber doors loomed ahead, polished and grand, as if daring any who entered to challenge what awaited inside. JD paused only once, just long enough to draw a breath that seemed to steady not only his body, but his soul. Then he stepped through. Inside, the room was already filling, the air thick with anticipation, tension, and the barely concealed triumph of those who believed the day was theirs. The hum of conversation filled the space. Soft, controlled, measured, the kind of sound that comes when outcomes feel predetermined and challenges seem pointless. JD moved to his desk, eyes forward, his mind focused. The documents in his folder felt heavier now, as if they carried not just facts but the hopes of the mill towns and communities that had been erased from the day's official agenda. He could see faces in his mind. Sam, broom in hand, but spirit unbroken. The girl's letter, simple and direct in its plea. His grandfather, boots worn but stride sure as he once walked into the mill at dawn. An aide appeared at his side, hesitant, eyes darting as if uncertain whether to speak. JD turned to him, voice calm but firm. "I need my 5 minutes. Confirm it." The aide nodded, slipping away to relay the request. JD watched as the message was passed to the chair, who glanced up with a flicker of annoyance, barely masked by his practiced smile. For a moment, the chair conferred with his staff, weighing whether to allow this interruption to the smooth schedule so carefully orchestrated. But the request had been granted earlier, and to deny it now would be too bold, even for them. A gavel tapped lightly, the signal for order. The room began to still, conversations fading, attention turning toward the front as the final preparations for the vote took shape. But before the proceedings could advance, the chair's voice rose, pleasant but edged with impatience. "Senator Vance has requested 5 minutes before the vote. The floor is his." JD rose, gathering his notes with steady hands. His heart beat with the rhythm of resolve, loud in his ears but steady as steel. The hall that had felt so cold, so indifferent, now became his battleground, not in anger, but in duty. He walked slowly to the front, every step measured, every breath purposeful. The chamber watched, some with curiosity, some with thinly veiled contempt, others with the nervous energy of those who feared what might be said. JD reached the podium and placed his folder gently before him. The room fell quiet, not the silence of peace, but the charged hush that comes before the breaking of a storm. The lobbyist's smiles faded, the aide's pen stilled. The machine paused just for a moment as one man stood ready to speak. And as JD lifted his gaze, looking out at the assembly that held so much power over so many lives, he knew that this was the moment that mattered. 5 minutes, one voice, and everything at stake. For a moment, JD simply stood there, his hands resting on either side of the podium, letting the weight of the silence settle across the chamber. Every eye was on him now, some expectant, some wary, some clearly wishing he'd simply take his seat and let the day proceed as planned. But JD had no intention of letting this moment slip by. He let his gaze sweep the room once, as if to remind himself and them that this was not just about votes or numbers, but about lives. With measured calm, JD opened the folder, withdrew a set of folded papers, and placed them on the podium. Then, in a move that surprised many, he stepped away from the microphone, walking deliberately to a whiteboard set near the side of the chamber. A relic rarely used, more often hidden behind curtains than brought into debate. He picked up the marker, uncapped it with a soft snap, and began to draw. At first, the lines were simple, boxes connected by arrows, the kind of diagram any observer might dismiss as nothing more than a visual aid. But as JD spoke, the simplicity gave way to clarity, and clarity to shock. "Here is where the funds begin," JD said, his voice steady, his hand drawing a large box labeled Steelworker Recovery Funds. "This is what we promised the families in the towns we represent. This is what they were told would help rebuild their lives." He drew a thick arrow outward, branching into smaller lines that fed into boxes labeled with vague, official-sounding titles. International development partnerships, overseas infrastructure initiatives, cross-border innovation grants. "And here," JD continued, "is where the money flows next, not to Main Street, not to the mills, but to foreign contractors, to projects that sound noble but serve interests far from home." He stepped back, letting the chart speak for itself, its lines and labels forming a web of redirection that had been hidden in plain sight. A hush fell over the room, deeper than before, as senators leaned forward to study the connections. The shape of the scheme, dressed up as policy, sold as progress, was undeniable now. JD tapped the board gently, the sound sharp in the stillness. "This is not about alliances or modern leadership. This is about abandoning our own under the guise of looking outward, and we are set to do it with a single vote today." A murmur rippled through the chamber, soft at first, then rising. Some faces paled, eyes flicking to colleagues, to notes, to the very documents that had seemed so clean, so unassailable only hours before. Others shifted uncomfortably in their chairs, as if trying to shrink from the diagram that laid bare the truth they'd chosen not to see. From the gallery above, an audible gasp broke the quiet, and for a heartbeat, the polished machinery of the Capitol seemed to stall, caught in the web JD had revealed. JD let the marker fall to rest at the edge of the board, turned back to the podium, and let his eyes meet the gaze of the room. "Look at it. Tell me I'm wrong. Tell the towns you serve that this is what they deserve, to be traded away without so much as a word of honest debate." No one answered. The usual rhythm of objection, of interruption, of deflection, gone. JD had seized the floor not through force but through truth, and in that moment the chamber had no defense. And as the stillness deepened, JD knew the storm had broken. Now came the reckoning. The diagram stood stark and undeniable behind him, the inked lines like scars laid bare for all to see. But JD knew facts alone wouldn't be enough. Numbers and arrows could map the betrayal, but it was voices, real human voices, that would remind this chamber, in this nation, who would bear the cost. He drew a breath, steadying himself, feeling the full weight of the moment press upon him. Then he spoke, and the chamber leaned in, the storm he had summoned now silent, waiting for what would come next. "I want to tell you about a man I met just days ago, in a town many here have forgotten," JD began, his voice clear, though his throat tightened with each word. "His name is Sam. He worked the mills his whole life. When the furnaces went cold, when the jobs left, Sam didn't. He stayed. He became a janitor at the old school because someone had to look after what was left. He told me he'd go back to the mill in a heartbeat. That work built this country, and he'd do it again. But instead, he sweeps empty halls in a town that once rang with the sound of shifts changing and children laughing. J.D. paused, letting the image settle over the chamber. He could see faces change, expressions soften, as the weight of the man's story reached ears grown too accustomed to distance. And there's Maria, J.D. continued, who worked in the cafeteria at that same school. After the plant closed, her husband picked up shifts wherever he could. 2 jobs, sometimes 3. She's battling health problems now, the kind that pile up when you don't have good insurance anymore. But she keeps going, because she doesn't know how to stop. The words filled the room, but no one moved. The usual rustle of papers, the tapping of pens, the quiet side talk, all gone. J.D. had their attention, but not because he demanded it. Because for the first time in that chamber in too long, someone had spoken of the cost not in dollars, but in lives. J.D.'s hand trembled slightly as he reached into his folder, drawing out the letter he kept close. The one that had traveled with him from his office to this floor. The paper was creased, its edges soft from being unfolded and folded again, but the handwriting remained clear, each letter shaped by a child's careful hand. He held it before him, his voice quieter now, but all the stronger for its honesty. She wrote, "Please don't let them take Daddy's job. That's all. No long argument, no complex policy. Just a plea from a child who wants her family whole, her town alive." His voice cracked on the last words, the emotion too raw to mask. For a moment he looked down, the letter trembling slightly in his grasp, then back at the chamber. The silence that followed was deeper than before. It wasn't the silence of politeness or of waiting for a speaker to finish. It was the silence of truth heard and felt. The kind that left no room for pretense. J.D. let it linger, let it settle. He wanted them to sit with it, to feel what he had felt standing in that steel town, seeing what had been lost, knowing what was at stake. "You can vote how you choose," J.D. said finally, voice steady once more. "But don't pretend not to know who pays the price. Because I've seen them, and now, so have you." He placed the letter gently on the podium, as if laying down a flag, and the chamber remained still, held in the gravity of the voices he had carried there. For a long moment, the chamber remained suspended in that profound stillness, the kind that follows when truth has been spoken plainly, without flourish or pretense. J.D. stood at the podium, his hand resting lightly on the worn letter, his eyes steady as they swept the faces before him. And in that quiet, the weight of his words began to do what no political maneuvering could. It made them think. Questions began to ripple through the room, first as glances exchanged between colleagues, then as low murmurs that grew in force. Senators leaned toward one another, no longer with the practiced ease of those trading sound bites, but with the tension of people realizing they stood on a precipice they had not fully seen until now. J.D. watched as swing voters, those who had come in resigned to supporting the package, those who had privately expressed unease but expected to fall in line, now shifted in their seats. One veteran senator furrowed his brow, studying the flow chart J.D. had drawn, his fingers tapping a restless rhythm against the desk. Another, known for pragmatism over passion, whispered to her aide, eyes never leaving the diagram and the letter that lay beside it. The lobbyists who had filled the gallery with quiet confidence minutes before now sat rigid, their smiles gone, replaced by tight expressions as they sensed the ground beneath them beginning to shift. The machine that had seemed so unstoppable had, for the first time, faltered. J.D. drew a breath, feeling the moment hang before him, fragile and fleeting. His voice, when it came, was quiet but resolute, carrying not just to the ears of those in the chamber, but to the hearts he hoped would listen. "You can choose today who we are," he said, his tone firm but not accusing, as if offering not condemnation, but a chance at redemption. A nation that remembers its workers, or one that abandons them. The words landed not like a hammer, but like a weight placed gently yet unmistakably in their hands. And as J.D. stepped back from the podium, As he let the silence reclaim the space, the choice became theirs to carry. The chair cleared his throat, the polished ease of earlier now absent from his voice. He glanced toward his colleagues, toward the faces that no longer reflected certainty, and hesitated just long enough for the room to feel it. Then, with a nod to the clerk, he spoke the words that few had expected at the start of that day. In light of new concerns raised, the motion for a final vote is postponed pending further review. The gavel came down, not with triumph or finality, but with the weight of unfinished business. A collective exhale seemed to fill the chamber, though no one cheered, no one clapped. The moment was too raw, too real for that. JD gathered his notes quietly, his heart pounding not with victory, but with the knowledge that a door had been kept open, at least for now. He caught the eye of one swing senator, who offered a small nod, not of allegiance, but of respect. That was enough. As the chamber began to empty, as staffers filed out, JD remained for a moment longer, standing before the diagram, the letter, the echo of his own words. The storm he had walked into had not passed, but for the first time, the wind had shifted, and as he finally turned to go, the hum of conversation behind him sounded different now. Less certain, more thoughtful. The fight was far from over, but the tide had begun to turn. The chamber emptied slowly, its usual hum of conversation replaced with a quieter, more thoughtful murmur. JD walked the corridors of the Capitol, his mind still echoing with the weight of what had just unfolded. But even as he left behind the polished floors and marble columns, the storm he had stirred did not stop at the chamber doors. Outside, beyond the reach of lobbyists and polished speeches, the country had begun to take notice. It started with a single clip, a shaky phone recording from the gallery, posted online within minutes of JD stepping down from the podium. The flow chart, the letter, the quiet strength in his voice as he spoke for those long forgotten by the political machine. It spread faster than any press release or official statement. News outlets picked it up next, first as a curious segment buried between more expected headlines, but soon as the lead story. By the time JD reached his office, the airwaves had caught fire. Anchors replayed his words, pausing on the diagram, on the image of the child's letter, on the silent, stunned faces of the chamber. The debate that had been rushed, smoothed over, packaged for easy passage now belonged to the people, and they were not ready to let it go quietly. Social media lit up, voices from every corner of the country rising in unison, where before there had been only scattered frustration. Hashtags like hashtag Steal for America and hashtag Stand with JD trended within hours, climbing from local feeds to national prominence. Workers posted photos of their fathers and grandfathers in hard hats. Mothers shared memories of towns that had raised generations, now fighting to stay alive. At the gates of shuttered mills, families gathered as dusk fell, their faces illuminated by the soft flicker of candles. Small vigils began, not coordinated by unions or campaigns, but by neighbors, friends, people who understood without needing to be told that JD's fight was their fight too. In one town, a boy no older than the one who had written the letter stood beside his mother, holding a handmade sign that simply read, "Don't forget us." His eyes, wide and hopeful, were captured in a photograph that would make the front page of morning papers across the nation. JD watched from his office as the coverage unfolded, the magnitude of it both humbling and galvanizing. His speech had been for the chamber, yes, but it was always meant for the people beyond its walls. And now those people had heard it. His aides moved around him, phones ringing, emails flooding in, offers for interviews, requests for statements, invitations to appear on talk shows. But JD waved them off for the moment. He needed no spotlight. The voices that mattered most were already speaking, and his job now was to listen, to prepare for what came next. Outside his window, the Capitol dome glowed softly in the night, no longer a symbol of indifferent power, but a reminder of the duty that came with standing beneath it. JD drew a breath, steady and sure. The machine hadn't stopped. The storm hadn't passed. But for the first time in too long, America was watching, and he would not let them down. The quiet of JD's office after the storm was short-lived. The same speech that had ignited vigils and inspired hashtags also drew the relentless glare of the national spotlight. It wasn't long before invitations and demands came from talk shows, radio programs, and roundtables eager to dissect his stand. And JD, knowing the fight could not be won in silence, stepped forward to face them. The first appearances were measured, polite on the surface, but beneath that veneer lay pointed questions and veiled barbs. One anchor leaned forward, voice smooth but laced with challenge. "Senator Vance, some say your speech, while passionate, smacks of outdated nationalism. Are you turning your back on America's role as a global leader?" JD met the question without flinching, his tone calm but unwavering. "I'm not turning my back on anything," he said. "I'm standing up for communities we've left behind while we chase that role. Being a leader doesn't mean abandoning your own." Another host came at him from a different angle, eyebrows raised in theatrical skepticism. "There are those who say you're a hero, Senator, that you've given a voice to the forgotten. What do you say to that?" JD shook his head slightly, the weight of the word hero sitting uncomfortably on his shoulders. "This isn't about me. It's about them. The fathers working 2 jobs, the mothers keeping their families together without health care, the kids who wonder if their town will be here when they grow up. I spoke because someone had to remind us who we're supposed to be fighting for." Clip after clip made the rounds. JD defending his stance with quiet conviction, refusing to be cornered into slogans or sound bites. He didn't argue for isolationism. He argued for balance. He didn't reject progress. He demanded that progress include the people who built the foundation the nation stood on. And as the interviews aired, as debates swirled on airwaves and online, JD didn't seek to win over every critic. He only sought to keep the conversation honest, to keep the focus on the mill gates where candles still flickered, on the small towns that still waited for someone to mean what they said. The storm of words raged around him, but JD stood steady, not as a politician chasing approval, but as a man determined to see the promise he'd carried from the Milltown floor to the Capitol floor through to the end. The storm of interviews, debates, and headlines faded into the night, leaving JD alone once more with his thoughts. The Capitol steps stretched before him, cold beneath his shoes, the marble worn smooth by generations of men and women who had climbed them carrying their own hopes and burdens. JD descended slowly, each step measured, the weight of the day heavy but not crushing. The hum of the city beyond was distant now, a quiet backdrop to his thoughts. He reached the bottom and paused, hands tucked in his coat pockets, eyes lifted to the city lights that flickered like 1,000 small promises. The night air was crisp, clean, and it cleared the noise that had filled his head in studios and chambers all day. Alone beneath the vast sky, he let the echoes of the past rise once more. He could hear his grandfather's voice, rough with age and work, steady as the steel he'd shaped for a lifetime. "Always stand for what's right, boy, even if you're the only one standing." JD could almost feel the old man's hand on his shoulder again, a weight as familiar as it was comforting. The sounds came back too, the factory whistle that had marked the start of each shift in the town that raised him, the clang of metal on metal, the low murmur of workers heading in at dawn. He remembered the parades too, flags snapping in the breeze, bands playing songs that made even the most tired faces lift with pride, children waving as if the future was theirs for the taking. Now, as JD gazed out over the city, those memories didn't haunt him. They fueled him. They reminded him why he'd spoken, why he'd stood his ground when it would have been easier to step aside. The lights of Washington sparkled against the dark, each one a reminder of the work still ahead. JD drew a long breath, feeling resolve settle over him like armor. The battle was far from over, but tonight, as the city slept, he stood ready for whatever came next. And with that quiet determination, JD turned, climbing the steps once more, the Capitol rising behind him like a promise he intended to keep. The morning sky over the steel town glowed with soft gold as JD stepped out of his car and onto ground that felt, for the first time in years, alive again. The steel mill rose ahead of him, no longer a hollow monument to better days, but a place reborn. The air, once heavy with silence, now pulsed with sound. The steady hum of machinery, the rhythmic clatter of work returned. As JD walked toward the gate, the workers paused in their tasks, offering nods, handshakes, firm claps on the shoulder. There was no fanfare, no speeches, just respect, the kind that spoke louder than any headline or camera flash. Sparks flew from the welders' torches, bright against the gray of the buildings. The deep thrum of engines echoed across the yard, blending with the calls of foremen and the familiar clang of steel meeting steel. JD stood for a moment at the edge of the activity, taking it all in. The heat, the noise, the movement, the undeniable sense that hope had come home. The smokestacks, once cold and lifeless, sent thin trails of smoke skyward again, signaling not just work, but renewal. A worker in a hard hat passed, grease streaked on his sleeve, and tipped his head in greeting. "Welcome back, Senator." JD smiled, shook his hand, and watched as he went on with his task, the rhythm of the mill steady, strong, unbroken. There was nothing more to say. The mill spoke for itself. When JD returned to Washington, the echoes of that day stayed with him. The sound of the machines, the smell of steel and sweat and promise. Back in his office, he reached for the letter that had been with him through it all. The little girl's words, simple and pure, had guided him like a compass through the storm. He smoothed the paper, now worn soft at the edges, and placed it in a frame, positioning it above his desk, where it would be the first thing his eyes met each morning. Beneath it, in his own hand, he wrote a note. "Leadership is defending those the world forgets." The staff noticed it before he spoke of it. They would pause at the doorway, drawn by the quiet power of those words. Some would smile, others would stand in silence for a moment longer, as if drawing strength from it. JD said nothing of the letter or the note. He didn't need to. The message was clear enough. The office itself became something different after that. Not just a place of paperwork and meetings, but a space where purpose lived, visible in every glance that lifted to the framed reminder on the wall. And when new aides joined the team, it was the first thing they saw, the silent standard by which they came to understand the work. Weeks passed, and the chambers of Congress returned to their familiar rhythms. The debates, the deals, the daily noise of governance. But beneath that hum, something had shifted. JD saw it in the faces of those who now nodded to him in the halls, in the subtle change of tone when forgotten industries were mentioned, in the conversations that no longer dismissed places like the steel town as relics of a bygone era. One afternoon, JD sat quietly in the gallery, listening as a freshman senator, young, earnest, still finding his footing, rose to speak. His voice shook at first, but steadied as he found his purpose. The senator spoke of communities left behind, of industries written off as obsolete, of towns that deserved not pity but partnership. He spoke of dignity, of work, of America's obligation to its own. JD watched, unmoving, as the speech unfolded. The words weren't his, but the heart behind them was familiar. The fight he'd begun had found another voice, and that, JD knew, was how change endured. Not in one moment or one speech, but in the stands that inspired others to stand as well. As the young senator finished, JD felt the hint of a smile at the corners of his mouth. The chamber, so often a place of noise without meaning, now carried the echo of something true, something that would not so easily be silenced again. He rose, stepping out into the fading light of the afternoon. The city stretched before him, busy, restless, but somehow different now, shaped in some small way by the stand he had taken and by the voices it had helped awaken. And as he walked down the steps of the Capitol, past tourists with cameras and aides with armfuls of papers, past the monuments to the nation's past, JD's mind returned to the mill, to the sparks flying bright against the steel, to the sound of machines humming with life once more. The steel of a nation is forged in moments like these, JD thought, the words as steady in his heart as the work that continued, unseen but unyielding, in the places he would never forget. This story reminds us that true leadership isn't loud or fleeting. It's found in quiet moments of courage when someone chooses to stand for those the world overlooks. JD's journey shows that even in the face of powerful machines, one voice can spark change and inspire others to rise. It's a reminder that hope is built not by promises, but by action. What would you stand up for if you had just 5 minutes to speak your truth? If this story touches you, don't let it stop here. Like, share, and subscribe to JD Stories, where every voice matters and every story echoes far beyond the screen. This story is a fictionalized and dramatized narrative created for educational, inspirational, and storytelling purposes. While it may be inspired by real public events, people, or societal issues, it includes imagined dialogue, reconstructed scenes, and character interpretations meant to highlight broader themes of justice, dignity, and resilience. Any resemblance to actual events or individuals beyond public knowledge is purely coincidental. We do not intend to defame, mislead, or harm, but to invite reflection and meaningful conversation. Thank you for watching JD Stories.